Okay, so the title of my paper, the main title, is Taking Cinematic Aesthetics into Outer Space. It might as well have been taking Rancière's aesthetic regime of art into cultural studies. And as the subtitle kind of hints, the subtitle Paper Soldier and Dreaming of Space, what I'm going to do today is take you through two movies and try to provide like a detailed analysis, a detailed reading of them against the backdrop of the aesthetic regime of art. Partially because I think it's important to take you through the process to kind of address the question, which I'm going to try to elaborate, and partially because I think that cultural studies as an interdisciplinary field still have a long way to go before they can grasp the significance of Rancière's conceptualization of art. So this contribution is going to be a little bit more practical. I'm not going to go into theoretical, meta-theoretical explorations as much as my colleagues who presented before. So to start off, my paper focuses on two recent examples of Russian cinematography. Alexei Uchityr's Dreaming of Space from 2005 and Alexei German Jr.'s Paper Soldier from 2008. These are two films which are overtly preoccupied with the beginning of the space age, i.e. Gagarin's flight or the launch of the Sputnik, or both, so the late 50s, the early 60s of the 20th century, and its implications. And both films are part of a peculiar segment of contemporary 21st century Russian cultural production, which is called basically works on outer space. So these works range from novels, games, cartoons to documentaries, historical TV drama, docudrama, television films, and feature films of different genres. The only feature that seems to bring them into the same category is their thematic preoccupation, which is outer space. Or rather, upon close inspection of this category, it appears that the thematic preoccupation is more or less the so-called dawn of the space age, which is, in the Russian context, aligned first and foremost with the launch of the Sputnik and Gagarin's flight. The two films that I will be talking about today fall into this category, and I would like to argue that if these films are interpreted against the backdrop of the aesthetic regime of art rather than in terms of, for example, representation or other explanatory frameworks, that it is possible to say that their main preoccupation lies in the question that the dawn of the space age poses for subjectivity. Namely, what does it mean, what could it mean to be either a human or a subject or both in the space age? The question itself might not be particularly new. It may be traced down, for example, to Kazimir Malevich's suprematist artworks and writings, as well as to numerous reflections on the beginning of the space age from the second half of the 20th century. For example, Lacan's quote from television that the subject, the man after the moon landing, may never be the same man as the one who actually went to the moon in the first place, because he's witnessed an event which was born in mathematical discourse. Anyway, in the broadest sense, the preoccupation seems to be with the future of, for some, the human condition, and for some, of its links to human form and subjectivity. So in the space age, it seems that these categories no longer need to or necessarily coincide. Anyway, if the question itself is not particularly new, the way in which the two films address it is. I would claim these are two aesthetic returns or resurrections of this event, the beginning of the space age that happened 5 decades ago. It could be said that the films are two propositions about the significance of this event on the level of the subject. They're not at all representations of socio-political realities, but rather constructions of hypothetical modes of being which are about to be tested by an event which is about to come, and they no longer belong to the order which is still untouched by that future rupture. However, most existent analysis of these films tend to explain them away as aestheticized nostalgia for communist utopia of outer space conquest, which was present in Soviet Russia. So, as I suspect that some people might not be familiar with the two works, I would like to begin with a brief contextual note. Both films Dreaming of Space, or literally, if we take a literal translation of the Russian title, it would be Space as a Premonition, and Paper Soldier. Here the translation is fine. Both of the films came out during what might be called a new post-Soviet wave of cinema on outer space, and were shot by directors who have very distinct styles. In the Russian taxonomy, in the taxonomy of Russian film criticism, they fall under the category of art house cinema, in the vulgar understanding of the term, which means intellectual films, which are often presumably shot for the foreign public. This is not the premise I'm going to build on, it's just a contextual note. Both films build on the cosmos-oriented cinematic tradition of the Soviet Union, but they also appear to defy it. They recount events and play with people from a time right before the dawn of the space age, right before Gagarin's flight, but are also very explicit about the various layers of fiction, lies, secrecy, mystery surrounding that, or basically active in that context. Finally, on the surface, it seems that both films are concerned with the individual and not with outer space at all. Yet this is the very point that I think is worth exploring further, because it leads us back to the question of what might be left of the subject or of the human in the space age. And this is also the point that reveals that the two films are not at all in the same manner relatable to the aesthetic regime of art, which might be, which might be the opinions some people might have by just reading the synopsis. So let's begin with Dreaming of Space. I have just a few screenshots to make it easier to visualize. Okay, so the narrative of this melancholic and very stylized, as you can see, account of the late 50s in an obscure town in the Russian north is really simple. We get a glimpse into the life of two men, their relations. Here's one of the men, Horsey or Kanyok, their relations with two women and their involvement in the cosmonaut training program. So one of the men, German, this guy, which is an allusion to German Titov, the cosmonaut who was supposed to do the first flight but was substituted by Yuri Gagarin right before the flight, apparently because, among other reasons, because his name was German, which alluded to Germany, which was not so popular in the Soviet Union at the time. Anyway, he is a highly motivated guy who is apparently a little bit too intelligent for his own good. He's studying English, and apparently he's trying to find a way out of the USSR, either by ship or by spaceship, as it seems. His space enthusiasm is caught on by a more simple-minded fellow who goes by the name of Kanyok, and he's a cook in a local restaurant in the Mensa. This is Kanyok with his boxing coach. I would argue that these two men represent one subject, actually, because they don't really function at all without one another. They appear static and flat, and I don't think it's a case of Brechtian psychoanalyzation at work. But, well, on the other hand, they don't function too well together either, but they do manage to drive the film, not necessarily the narrative, but the film as an exploration of subjectivity. They manage to drive it forward. And the director employs several different techniques in order to create this double-headed subject, whose head appears to be facing the same direction with an obscure goal, but the feet are pulling them in different directions. So throughout the first half of the film, the camera follows Kanyok, this guy, who's following an intriguing stranger, German. Then around halfway through the film, the point of view changes, and the camera starts squinting at both characters, examining them from the side in medium shots. And then in the last third of the film, the director intentionally, almost loudly in the visual sense, turns the gaze of the camera by another quarter. There's a tracking shot following someone who is dressed like German, and it's suddenly followed by a medium close-up that shows us the person en face. And the person we see is not German, but rather Kanyok, who is merely dressed up in German's clothing, as we can see in these two shots. This is followed by a long shot of both characters, which we see through the window of a tram, and the glass window seemingly solidifies the image of the two men who are now wearing very similar clothes, and these men exchange a secret. Only at this point, both the spectator and one of the men, German, so the mysterious person, we know that this secret is actually a lie. German claims that he is training to become the first cosmonaut, although this is just another layer of fiction. Apart from the gaze of the camera, there are other circumstances that reinforce the split and illogical unity which is embodied by German and Kanyok. The first are curiosities in the fabula which seem to drive the socialist, realist canonical logic of irrational connections to the extreme. Kanyok has no idea who German is, what this mysterious persona does, why he studies foreign languages, why he practices boxing and regularly swims in the ice-cold sea. In spite of that, he makes a blind decision, as advised by his boxing coach, to befriend the stranger and to follow him around everywhere he goes. He does not reconsider this decision despite German's apparent lack of enthusiasm and despite the fact that German proceeds to coldly seduce his girlfriend. Meanwhile, the camera insists. There are long shots that show the coast, the bridge, which is a common meeting place, and the forest, where Kanyok often falls off his bike with a girl in the back seat. All of these shots are really fuzzy and unclear. Medium shots, on the other hand, are always in motion. They shake and they shift and they slide, and it seems as if the subject is what is caught somewhere between these extremes. It's captured in the medium long shot, but not as a stabilization or a clarification of the image, but rather as a sort of a mock-up, a caricature, just like the caricature that Kanyok is when he's dressed in German's clothing. He does not become German, he just becomes an inefficient replica. It may be possible to argue that this split has nothing to do with just a single person, with either of the two. Rather, it's the split that marks the way that the film is driven forward, the way that it works. It enacts the film's obsession with the nearing but faraway the imminent but incomprehensible advent of the space age, which would redefine what it would be what it would mean to be human forward in the future. This statement is reinforced by the relationship between the sound and the image in the film. Most of the music of the film is diegetic, which might be a stylistic allusion to the socialist realist tradition of Soviet cinematography. Most of the music heard in the film comes from radio transmitters on the set, and wherever the music source, there's music that the source of which cannot be traced down as easily, such as the music accompanying the closing credits, then it is thematically directly linked to the ideas picked upon by the narrative, such as the Soviet national idea, which seems to provide explanations for inexplicable action. However, I would argue that it's not the presence or the functions of the music in this movie that are striking. What strikes most is its loudness. Compared to the dialogue, the music is exceptionally loud and sounds like it's being forced into the shot, like it's not organically incorporated into them. The dialogue, on the other hand, seems to have been muted intentionally so that it is uncleared and muffled. And this stylization, which foregrounds the music, creates a remarkable contrast between the visual and the sonic images and the spoken word, between technology and the ambient that it intrudes into. Layered upon one another, all of these techniques almost seem excessive. Yet there is no real closure, there is no catharsis. The film does not make much sense if we watch it through a progressive or a deconstructionist lens. However, if it is seen from the point of view of post-Soviet reflections on the impending space age, then it produces a sense of uncomfortable unity, which is marked by the gap between the event of the dawn of the space age and existent explanatory frameworks for it. I would argue that it manages to construct a subject which both is and is no longer human in the old-fashioned traditional sense of the word, which seems to be driven somewhere into the darkness and does not really have much of an ear of what might be expected of it on Earth. This film, Dreaming of Space, is often placed into the same basket as Paper Soldier, which is another film by a Russian filmmaker reflecting on the Soviet space program just before the beginning of the space age. Tellingly enough, the director himself, Alexei German Jr., said in one of the interviews that this is not a film about what is, but rather a film about what could have been. This is not what was going on at the Cosmodrome in Baikonur, but it could have been. Even without this hint, it's clear that the temporality and the space created by the film have no pretense in reconstructing the past or in deconstructing myths about it. This is clear starting with the title. The Paper Soldier alludes to a famous song by Soviet singer and songwriter Bulata Kudrava, who was a popular regime-defying song of the Soviet thaw, so the late 50s, early 60s. However, according to the archives, the song had not become famous until 1962 or even 1963. In any case, it came out later than 1961 when the events of the film take place. The film operates within an array of symbols which, from the perspective of today's audience, do belong to the thaw. But in their disconnectedness, they seem to only point out that for this work, the thaw is nothing but a loose net of symbols, which are comfortable and fun to connect in detached intellectual play of intertextual associations, but not more. So this symbolic thaw, which appears to be stranded in time somewhere in the Soviet province, haunts the protagonists' clothing, their hairstyles, the contradictions between the enthusiasm of science and the often horrible work conditions they have to deal with. The universe of the film extends between Moscow, which is the workplace of the protagonists, Dr. Daniil and his wife Nina on the screenshot, and Baikonur, the cosmodrome, where they travel to take part in cosmonaut training, as they think. Later it turns out that the program is a farce, it's fictitious. There is not much of a storyline to the film. It's more of a time image, which is as if trying to hint that the eclectic symbolic universe is merely an amplifier for a cataclysm which occurs on a different level. The film creates an apocalyptic time. This is also the only function of the symbolism of the first examples of spaceflight, which is a symbolism that reeks of the barracks and mud of the Gulag, the working conditions for the team in Baikonur. The barracks are inhabited by the neurotic offspring of the Soviet intelligentsia, seemingly also of the 19th century Russian intelligentsia, such as from Turgenev's novel Fathers and Children. Daniil lives for an idea, and Nina, his wife, appears to be living for love, as the only action she ever takes in the movie is actually reacting to Daniil's ever more obvious coldness toward her. Daniil is choleric, and Nina seems to be somewhat hysterical. Their dialogues are reminiscent of the characters from Chekhov's plays. At the end of the film, Nina and Vera, Daniil's lover, who becomes friends with his wife after his death, actually cite Chekhov's Our Uncle Vanya, and they cite a point about having to keep enduring the misery and suffering of life forever and ever. In this context, where the temporality seems aligned with these characters, spaceflight seems to be an endeavor with no ear for the problems of the extremely reflexive Russian intelligentsia concerned with issues of global human significance. This point is brought across both by the visual aesthetics of the film and through individual characters. Daniil only cares about global morality, and potential cosmonauts seem to be wandering through the marshes aimlessly in their scaphanders. This is shown in long shots as if underscoring the senselessness of the activity. Daniil is seemingly aimless about using a bike to make a few rounds around the marshes before collapsing into his own death. He dies of heart failure. This is in no relation to his pale complexion and the constant cough, which is also elusive of 19th century intelligentsia. The premonition of the space age here functions as a chip of the myth of the thaw, which is tied to attempts at synthesizing cosmic questions about life and fate to those of love for the individual. The synthesis fails, but it succeeds in perpetuating the idea of the Russian intelligentsia developed by Nina and Vera, who live. The symbolist poetics of the film generates the unarticulated aspect of the myth of spaceflight, which cannot simply be equated to an attempt to tell the people about the heroes behind the cosmonauts. I think it thinks through the implications of the program for the subject. What would it mean to send the human subject into a badly researched, alien, totally foreign environment? Certain Russian critics were appalled by the film. In a way, this can be explained by certain inconsistencies in it. The poetics seem so eclectic that it is unclear where the main reference points of the symbolism actually are. It may be seen, of course, as aiming at the generation of the шестидесятники in Russian, so those people who were adults during the thaw and saw all of its ideals collapse. This is embodied in the oxymoronic myth of optimism, which is in the movie is anchored somewhere between the promises of the democratization of the thought and the promises of new collectivism embodied by the space program. This antinomy amounts to the idea that the film is exotic, which pushes it into the realm of attempts of reconstructing or reinforcing the myth of Russian cinematic exoticism exhibited by Russian art cinema of the late 90s and the early 21st century. If read in this way, the film makes the spaceflight dream seem like a dream of conjoining the formative nationalist myth with a theurgic yearning for a transcendent redemption of the individual in collective unity. This dream functions as the other side of Daniil's internal rift. Daniil is split between his scientific stance, which says he should follow the logic of his desire, which is idealist faith in science on the level of this movie, and the responsibility that he accords to the Russian intelligentsia. According to his heart attack, he identifies with the latter. Both readings lead to the same conclusion. Relying on the timeless concept of the Russian intelligentsia, the film manages to get diverted from treating spaceflight in all of its frightening ungraspability, which is directed at the subject. Relying on the intelligentsia, which is still an elusive concept rather than any kind of viable collective identification, elevates the issue to the level of symbols, which might appear equal to one another if we interpret them as part of a simulacrum, but actually they remain incorporated here into a teleological matrix, into the search for logic, which would provide evidence of the possibility of theurgy, of redemption, and therefore give an excuse for the individual's internal suffering. Therefore, it appears that the film does use postmodernist techniques, but as a whole, in my opinion, it reveals that the question it poses does not really reflect an understanding of art in terms of the aesthetic regime. I think I should stop here?
Yeah, 20 minut imamo, pa lakše zaključaš.
Yeah, I think I would stop here because I just wanted to demonstrate the way these two films operate and how using the aesthetic regime as the backdrop for analysis allows to open up a lot more questions than criticism usually does. Thank you.